August 27th, 1979. The afternoon. 3 vehicles moving south along the A2 coastal road between Newry and Warrenpoint, County Down. A Land Rover at the front, 2 4-ton lorries behind it. In the back of those lorries, soldiers from the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment, 2 para. 6 weeks into what was scheduled as a 20-month tour of Northern Ireland, begun in July under Lieutenant Colonel Colin Thomson. By late August, a convoy run on a familiar road heading toward Newry was the kind of tasking that didn't generate particular concern. Inside the rear lorry, the soldiers are doing what soldiers do on these roads after a decade of this war: watching the treeline, checking the hedgerows, scanning the verges for anything that doesn't belong. A suspicious vehicle, an unusual activity, a gap in a wall, a man on high ground with a clear line to the road. The threat models were specific and practiced. Soldiers in Northern Ireland didn't just travel, they read the ground. It was a clear afternoon, warm enough for the hedgerows to be full and green. The road at that point ran flat and straight along the southern shore of Carlingford Lough, the tidal water marking the border with the Irish Republic visible to the left. To the right, ground rose slightly before the avenue of trees leading to Narrow Water Castle, a medieval tower house set back from the carriageway. At the castle boundary, a stone gate lodge sat directly across from the road. Solid granite, enclosed on 3 sides, substantial structural cover. At the roadside, a flatbed vehicle was parked with a load of straw bales. Nothing unusual about an agricultural lorry on a rural Irish road in late August. Across Carlingford Lough, in the thick woodland of the Cooley Peninsula's southern shore, inside the jurisdiction of the Irish Republic, men were watching the road through binoculars. They had been watching that stretch of the A2 for years. At 4:40 in the afternoon, as the rear lorry drew level with the parked flatbed, approximately 800 pounds of homemade explosive detonated. The blast destroyed the lorry. 6 soldiers from 2 para died instantly. Wreckage scattered across the carriageway and toward the water. 2 survivors from the rear vehicle were gravely wounded. Soldiers in the surviving vehicles dismounted, secured a perimeter, and called for reinforcements by radio. Across the loch, the men at the firing position watched the smoke. 6 dead. The convoy stopped, the ambush half complete. The British Army didn't just lose men that afternoon, they lost the ground. But that loss didn't begin at 4:40 on August 27, 1979. It had been accumulating for years, one drainage culvert at a time. Across a rural county, the British military had already, quietly, conceded they couldn't safely hold. To understand Warrenpoint, you need to understand the physical space, not as backdrop, as the primary weapon system. The A2 at Narrow Water wasn't a winding border lane. It ran relatively flat along the loch shore, a dual carriageway according to contemporary transport records. But the road geometry at Narrow Water Castle created a tactical constraint the Brigade had studied specifically. Water on the left, rising ground and dense woodland pressing in from the right. The stone gate lodge of the castle set directly across from the roadside position. A convoy struck at that point had nowhere to accelerate off the road, no alternative line to take, no cover except the granite structure opposite. The landscape at Narrow Water functioned as a trap, and it had done so since the castle was built. The backcountry roads near Crossmaglen, 7 miles northwest, were a different experience entirely. Sunken lanes, pre-modern tracks barely wide enough for a single military vehicle, cut between raised earthen banks topped with hedgerow 8 or 10 feet high. The surface dipped and rose constantly as it crossed the drainage geography of the drumlin country, and at every dip a concrete culvert pipe carried water beneath the road. An academic ethnographic study of the border community quoted a local resident describing the landscape as a nest of roads, a phrase that captures something precise about how the terrain worked. The lanes wound, crossed and recrossed, dissolved into farm tracks, re-emerged on the far side of a field boundary. The international border cut across roads and farmland without regard for geography, creating zones where cross-border movement was routine and where jurisdiction was genuinely ambiguous. For a British soldier in the back of a 4-ton lorry on one of those lanes, the tactical blindness was total. The driver could see perhaps 30 metres ahead. The soldiers in the cargo compartment could see nothing. The engine noise bounced off the hedgerow walls, that specific acoustic trap of driving between two high earthen banks, and filled the vehicle with a continuous racket that masked any sound from outside. Andy McNabb, who served with 2 Para in South Armagh, described the posting with a soldier's economy. They were told they were going to bandit country, and Crossmaglen was a town that makes the rest of bandit country look like Camberwick Green. The men in those vehicles knew, in an abstract way, that the road beneath them could have been prepared in advance. They also knew there was nothing they could do about it. You couldn't inspect every metre of tarmac before every patrol. You couldn't excavate every drainage ditch alongside every border lane. You drove and scanned and hoped. Beneath those roads, at regular intervals, ran the drainage infrastructure of a working Irish farming landscape. Concrete culvert pipes, typically 600 to 900 millimetres in diameter, buried under the carriageway to carry water from one field system to another. A forensic pathologist who worked the aftermath of South Armagh attacks described it plainly. These devices are placed in little culverts, and there are hundreds of them under rural Irish roads. Not dozens, hundreds. Every one accessible from the drainage ditch running beside the road. The South Armagh Brigade had mapped every one of them. The organisation that carried out the Warrenpoint attack had been operating in South Armagh since 1969, and it had been fighting the British in various forms in that terrain since 1921. An incident in August 1971, in which a local man named Harry Thornton was shot and killed by British soldiers in Belfast while staying in a car near Springfield Road Barracks, he and a colleague having been mistaken for gunmen, caused outrage across South Armagh and transformed local tolerance of IRA activity into active recruitment. The 3rd Battalion alone, operating between Drumintee and Keady, gained more than 60 new volunteers in the days immediately following Thornton's death. While the provisional IRA across the rest of Northern Ireland restructured itself during the late 1970s into a cell-based system, smaller units, compartmentalised, designed to limit the damage any single informer could do, South Armagh retained its battalion structure. 2 battalions, one based around Jonesborough, one around Crossmaglen. By the 1990s, the brigade numbered approximately 40 members, roughly half living south of the international border. The retention of that structure wasn't traditionalism. It was a calculated judgment that the close-knit rural community of South Armagh, bound by family connections and shared hostility to the British military presence, offered a natural counterintelligence protection that made the cell structure unnecessary. Toby Harnden, in Bandit Country, his authoritative account of the brigade, characterised it as the Provisional IRA's premier fighting unit. Military and intelligence assessments throughout the conflict consistently rated the South Armagh Brigade as the IRA unit least vulnerable to penetration by informers. In a conflict where British intelligence services eventually placed agents inside most IRA structures at significant depth, South Armagh remained largely opaque until the mid-1990s. That insularity produced something unusual in irregular armed groups: genuine institutional expertise. Devices placed in 1973 reflected lessons learned from devices placed in 1972. By 1979, the Brigade was operating with 6 years of iterative engineering refinement behind every operation. Their manufacturing capability was substantial. ANFO, ammonium nitrate mixed with fuel oil with commercial explosive used as a detonation booster, was producible in large quantities on working farms in the border region, available through the agricultural supply chain and storable without attracting unusual attention. An IRA operative's account of bomb-making in East Tyrone stated the process directly. Those landmines were made of homemade explosive, ANFO. Our aim was to produce ammonium nitrate. South Armagh Brigade engineers were doing the same at industrial scale. The statistics compiled from Royal Ulster Constabulary records describe what that capability produced across the full span of the campaign. Between 1970 and 1997, at least 165 deaths among British security forces, 123 soldiers and 42 RUC officers. The RUC recorded 1,255 bombings and 1,158 shootings in a 10-mile radius of the geographic centre of South Armagh across that period. Thomas Murphy, alleged to have commanded the brigade since the 1970s and also alleged to be a member of the IRA's Army Council, led an organisation that operated with striking consistency for over 2 decades. An IRA engineer named Eamon Maguire, a former senior Aer Lingus engineer, later identified by American intelligence as the IRA's chief technical officer, subsequently claimed that he and his team were personally responsible for forcing the British Army off the ground and into the air in South Armagh. Whether that credit belongs specifically to Maguire or is more accurately distributed across a generation of brigade engineers, the public record doesn't allow a definitive answer. What the record does confirm is the outcome he described. The Culvert bomb isn't in itself a sophisticated weapon. The sophistication is in the patience. The sequence began long before any device was built. Brigade engineers surveyed the target road on foot, sometimes across multiple visits over different seasons. They were identifying choke points, locations where a military convoy would necessarily slow, where there was no alternative route, where the road geometry would compress vehicles into a restricted kill zone. At each candidate location, they identified the drainage culvert, the concrete pipe running perpendicular beneath the carriageway to carry water from one field system to another. The explosive charge went into the pipe. For a substantial device, that meant packing hundreds of pounds of ANFO into a length of culvert, tamping the charge against the concrete walls and connecting the detonation circuit. The Parachute Regiment's South Armagh account from 1973 describes a 600-pound device placed precisely this way. The concrete pipe geometry did the work a cannon barrel does. It directed the energy. When the charge detonated, the blast had nowhere to go except upward, through the road surface and through the floor of whatever vehicle sat above it. The command wire ran from the bomb casing through the roadside drainage ditch, buried just below the soil surface, running under vegetation and along field margins for potentially hundreds of metres to a firing point with clear line of sight to the road. For one documented South Armagh attack near Drummuck the confirmed wire run was 300 metres. The wire was buried weeks before the intended detonation, sometimes months before, and the soil left to resettle above it. Vegetation recovered. A parachute regiment account from the 1973 South Armagh Culvert attack confirmed the operational discipline precisely. The command wires had been buried a long time earlier and were professionally hidden, invisible to surface inspection until after the bomb had already fired. The triggerman sat at the firing point with a detonator connected to his end of the wire. Timing was trained and practiced. Identify the vehicle. Identify a road reference point, a fence post, a painted road marking, a gate opening that will align with the vehicle's most vulnerable section at a specific moment during its passage. Count seconds. Close the circuit. Against this system, the British Army's electronic countermeasure technology was completely irrelevant. By the early 1970s, the Provisional IRA had begun triggering devices with repurposed radio control units from model aircraft. Simple, reliable, and fatally vulnerable to jamming. The British Army fitted jamming equipment to vehicles and helicopters throughout Northern Ireland. The IRA adapted, first encoding the transmission signals to defeat broadband jamming, then shifting to higher frequencies, then developing more sophisticated cipher technology to stay ahead of British countermeasures. By 1979, the Brigade was using encoded radio detonation systems for certain attacks, including Warrenpoint, that operated on cipher-protected frequencies the British jamming equipment couldn't interrupt. But the command wire stepped entirely outside the radio competition. A hard-wired circuit produces no signal whatsoever. There is no transmission to detect, no frequency to overwhelm, nothing for an ECM system to find. Academic analysis of IRA tactical innovation traced this dynamic directly. British introduction of electronic jamming against radio-controlled devices prompted the IRA to increase its use of hardwired command detonation, precisely because it rendered the jamming irrelevant. A command wire defeats a sophisticated ECM suite because it predates the concept of radio transmission. It's copper wire and a battery. It was old before jamming technology was invented. South Armagh's terrain made command wire operationally practical in a way it wouldn't have been on urban streets. A 300-metre wire run from a culvert charge through a drainage ditch alongside a border road, buried and left to settle for weeks, was concealed by the landscape itself, by the hedgerow, the drainage ditch, the undisturbed vegetation of the field margin. British helicopter patrols scanned for disturbed earth and exposed wire. They found devices sometimes. The 1,255 recorded bombings across the campaign measure how often they didn't. Security assessments of the South Armagh situation eventually stated the operational consequence in formal terms. No vehicular patrolling was permitted in this region. The IRA's ability to combine command wire detonation with culvert placement, a combination immune to ECM and functionally invisible to pre-patrol inspection, had made vehicle movement on these roads operationally incompatible with any acceptable standard of risk. Warrenpoint wasn't an improvised response to an opportunity. It was the culmination of a 7-year escalation in device scale and operational sophistication. In August 1972, the Brigade destroyed a Ferret armoured reconnaissance car with a 600-pound landmine, killing one British soldier. The Ferret was a light 2-man vehicle. The proof of concept was established. A buried charge of sufficient weight, placed precisely, could eliminate armoured transport outright. By 1973, culvert bombs were in regular operational use. The Parachute Regiment's South Armagh account from that year described a 600-pound device in a drainage culvert, professionally prepared and invisible until after detonation. The device weight had stabilised. The brigade was perfecting method before scaling mass. October 9th, 1975. A culvert bomb at Lurgan near Crossmaglen destroyed a Saracen armoured personnel carrier. Corporal Edward Gleeson was killed. The FV-603 Saracen, 6 wheels, 11.2 tons, introduced to British service in 1951, was the primary armoured troop carrier across much of the Northern Ireland deployment. Its armour was designed to defeat small arms fire and light fragment. The floor of a 1950s-era personnel carrier had been built to no mine protection specification at all, because in the early 1950s, mine blast protection, as an engineering discipline, barely existed. An upward pressure wave from a large buried charge didn't need to penetrate the steel. It needed only to exceed the structural tolerance of a floor designed with no thought of underslung blast. At Lurgan, the device exceeded that tolerance completely. According to Toby Harnden's research for Bandit Country, the decision to begin transitioning toward helicopter primary movement in South Armagh was made in the immediate wake of the Lurgan attack. If the most robust armoured vehicle routinely deployed on these roads could be destroyed outright by a buried charge, then ground movement to the most exposed bases in South Armagh was operationally incompatible with acceptable risk. Helicopter landing sites were established inside the perimeter fences at Crossmaglen, Fork Hill and Newtown Hamilton. The roads near those 3 bases had been functionally conceded. The concession didn't extend to every route in the area. The A2 between Newry and Warrenpoint, a busier road running along the loch shore, used by civilian traffic, was considered comparatively safer. The brigade had already noticed that assessment. The preparation for the August 27, 1979 attack was built around a 2-phase kill system, not a device and a contingency. One integrated operation with 2 sequenced components. The primary charge, approximately 800 pounds of ANFO, was loaded into a flatbed vehicle and covered with straw bales, then left parked at the roadside on the A2 at narrow water. An agricultural flatbed with agricultural cargo on a rural Irish road in late August attracted no particular notice. The vehicle had been in position long enough that its presence registered as background. The straw bales concealed the device completely. The secondary charge, described in military accounts of the attack as comparable in size to or larger than the primary, was concealed within the granite gate lodge of Narrow Water Castle, directly across the road from the flatbed's position. It had been placed there in advance. The firing position was across Carlingford Loch, inside the Republic of Ireland. Both devices were connected to encoded radio detonation systems, cipher-protected, operating on frequencies the British Army's jamming equipment couldn't interrupt. 2 paras convoy, the Land Rover and 2 4-ton lorries carrying soldiers from a regiment that had begun its Northern Ireland tour just 6 weeks earlier, left Ballykinler Barracks on the afternoon of August 27th and drove south toward Newry along the A2. The day was clear. The hills of the Cooley Peninsula across the water were visible. The stone towers of Narrow Water Castle were visible. The flatbed with the straw bales was at the roadside. Nothing about any of it registered as unusual. The rear lorry drew level with the parked vehicle at precisely 4:40 in the afternoon. The explosion destroyed the rear lorry. 6 soldiers from 2 para died instantly. The RTE news report, broadcast the following morning, described it with the economy of a journalist who has run out of words adequate to the scale. 6 soldiers were killed in the first explosion when a bomb in a lorry loaded with straw was detonated by remote control as the soldiers drove past. Wreckage, debris, and human remains scattered across the carriageway and toward the water. 2 survivors from the rear vehicle were gravely wounded. Soldiers from the surviving vehicles dismounted, established a rough perimeter, and called for reinforcements by radio. Across the loch, the men at the firing position watched and waited. Reinforcements flew in from Bessbrook Base in County Armagh, 8 miles to the northwest. Queen's Own Highlanders airlifted to the scene. Lieutenant Colonel David Blair, the Highlanders' commanding officer, arrived and took personal command. Blair was the senior officer present, and the situation demanded senior authority. 6 dead, multiple wounded, an exposed road position on a known attack route, a bomb scene to secure, casualties to evacuate, a perimeter to hold. A helicopter landed to take the most critically injured. The instinct for cover at a bomb scene needs no training to explain. The gate lodge of Narrow Water Castle was the obvious choice. Granite walls, an enclosed courtyard, structural mass on 3 sides. It was directly across the road. Blair and a concentration of soldiers, men from 2 Para and the Queen's Own Highlanders, moved to it and began establishing the incident command post. They were in the position the second device had been built to destroy. At approximately 5:10 in the afternoon, roughly 30 minutes after the first explosion, the second device detonated. The granite gate lodge of Narrow Water Castle was, structurally, a substantial piece of masonry. The explosion destroyed it. Large sections of stone were blasted outward across the carriageway. The RTE account broadcast on August 28th stated it plainly. The solid granite structure was completely destroyed in the blast, which killed 12 soldiers, some of whom had been sent in as reinforcements following the first explosion. Some of the bodies were thrown into Carlingford Loch by the force of the second blast. 12 more soldiers died. 10 were from 2 Para. 2 were from the Queen's Own Highlanders. One of those 2 was Lieutenant Colonel David Blair, the highest-ranking British officer killed in the entire Northern Ireland conflict to that point. His signaller died beside him. The helicopter carrying wounded from the first blast was taking off when the second bomb fired. The aircraft, an RAF Wessex, was damaged in the blast but didn't crash. A major at Bessbrook Base had been ordered to drive to Narrow Water and establish a security cordon. His name was Mike Jackson. He was a company commander in 2 Para, 37 years old. He drove to the scene from Bessbrook and arrived at Narrow Water shortly after the second explosion. At the 40th anniversary commemoration in 2019, General Sir Mike Jackson, who had risen to become Chief of the General Staff, the most senior officer in the British Army, described what he found when he arrived. Burning vehicles, dead bodies, bits of bodies. He was asked by Forces News whether, looking back 40 years, he had a military assessment of what the IRA had accomplished that afternoon. One's got to admit it was a clever plan, and they succeeded. Jackson had been asked at the scene to identify his friend, Major Peter Fursman. Anne Foblacht, in its original reporting from September 1979, included a quote from a British Army spokesman describing the ambush as having been laid with enormous skill. The BBC's contemporary account was unambiguous about the scale. It's the highest death toll suffered by the British Army in a single incident since it arrived in Northern Ireland to restore order a decade ago. 18 soldiers killed in total, more than 20 wounded. The single deadliest attack on the British Army across the entire 30-year span of the Troubles. The planning principle that made the double detonation possible was straightforward. The brigade anticipated that any successful first blast would drive surviving soldiers toward the obvious hard cover at the gate lodge across the road. The roughly 30-minute gap between detonations gave arriving reinforcements precisely the time needed to concentrate in the position that had been prepared for them. The forensic aftermath compounded the institutional grief. In 2012, a British tribunal heard that forensic evidence from the detonation site in County Louth, across the border where the firing position had been interfered with. The precise construction details of both devices, the routing of their circuits, the exact weight of each charge, couldn't be established through the physical record. The approximate figure of £800 for the primary device and a comparable or larger charge for the secondary are estimates derived from the scale of destruction and consistent with what the brigade was manufacturing and deploying in this period. The total explosive used across both devices has been estimated at around 700 kilograms. No one was ever officially charged with the Warrenpoint ambush. The institutional response to Warrenpoint was substantial and, in certain respects, effective. Maurice Oldfield, the former head of MI6, was appointed security coordinator for Northern Ireland in the immediate aftermath, a direct acknowledgement that the existing intelligence structure had failed to detect a multi-month preparation for an attack of this scale on a road the Army used regularly. The Force Research Unit, a British network of informers and agent handlers, was formalised in 1982 and eventually penetrated IRA structures across significant parts of Northern Ireland. 10 hilltop observation posts were erected across South Armagh from 1986 onward, providing persistent aerial surveillance of the border terrain. Between 1971 and the completion of those posts, 84 members of the security forces had been killed in the Crossmaglen and Forkhill areas alone. In the years following their construction, the rate fell substantially, roughly to a third of the previous yearly average. None of this resolved the road question. The Ministry of Defence's own analysis of Operation Banner, the British Army's 38-year Northern Ireland deployment, published in 2006, addressed the situation in language that needed no interpretation. Overt road movement was forbidden in South Armagh for many years. Not restricted, not discouraged, forbidden. The document described Army aviation as having contributed to a genuinely airmobile operational posture for the region, the official military phrasing for a force structure that had replaced ground movement with helicopters because ground movement had been rendered operationally untenable. The helicopter system that replaced road transport was substantial and sustained over 2 decades. At its centre was Bessbrook Mill, a converted Victorian linen factory in County Armagh, 8 miles north of Crossmaglen. The British Army took over the building and transformed it into the primary aviation hub for South Armagh operations. At the height of the conflict, by accounts from military historians of the air campaign, Bessbrook Mill had become the busiest heliport in Europe and possibly the world. Every soldier moving in or out of Crossmaglen, Forkhill or Newtown Hamilton flew through it. Every resupply run, every mail delivery. Air War Northern Ireland records the operational reality without softening it. The security forces relied almost entirely on helicopters for resupply, even having their rubbish flown out. Not just ammunition and food. The waste generated inside a forward operating base in South Armagh had to be loaded onto a helicopter and flown to a secure disposal location because there was no vehicle route that could safely carry it out. Veterans described the baseline conditions with the plainness of men who had lived inside the situation rather than analysed it from outside. A former serviceman interviewed by the BBC about the Forkhill base stated it without elaboration. You couldn't drive into Fork Hill if you were a soldier, you flew in. Another account described the condition as simply the assumption underlying daily life in South Armagh. Helicopters being the only means of transport and resupply. The roads were considered too dangerous for military. A former helicopter aircrewman, describing his tours from the aviation side of the operation, everything went by air to the outposts like Fork Hill or Crossmaglen. The border at the time was just a road across into the south. The British Army also made a territorial concession that stated the situation as physically as anything could. In the early 1970s, the Army seized land adjacent to Crossmaglen Rangers GAA Club grounds and built a helicopter landing pad inside the Crossmaglen barracks perimeter. The Crossmaglen Rangers is one of the oldest Gaelic football clubs in County Armagh. The Army took the land because it had no other way to supply the garrison. The RTE archives covered the return of those grounds in 1999, noting the occupation had begun in the early 1970s. Local people regarded the seizure as punitive. The Army regarded it as a logistics necessity. Both descriptions were accurate. The helicopters became the front line of a strategic reality the Brigade wasn't content to accept as permanent. They were treated as military assets, and they were attacked accordingly. Between 1978 and 1994, the South Armagh Brigade carried out 23 attacks on British military aircraft and brought 5 down. In February 1978, 18 months before Warrenpoint, a British Army Gazelle helicopter was shot down near Jonesborough during a simultaneous ground engagement between Brigade volunteers and British soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Ian Corden Lloyd, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion Royal Green Jackets, was killed in the crash. In June 1988, a Lynx was brought down. In February 1991, a second Lynx. In March 1994, a third Lynx was destroyed during a mortar attack on Crossmaglen Barracks. Toby Harnden assessed this as the most successful IRA helicopter operation of the entire conflict. Months later, the brigade shot down an RAF Puma. By 1994, the British Army had no reliable method of moving safely across South Armagh except by Chinook, the heaviest transport helicopter in the British military's inventory. Not armoured convoys, not Land Rovers fitted with ECM equipment, not any of the vehicles that had been destroyed one by one since 1972. Chinooks. The Culvert bomb campaign continued well after Warrenpoint. In April 1984, the brigade detonated a 1,000-pound landmine against an armoured police car on the Crossmaglen to Camloch Road. The scale had grown from the 600-pound devices of the early 1970s. In March 1989, the brigade killed Chief Superintendent Harry Breen and Superintendent Bob Buchanan, the two most senior Royal Ulster Constabulary officers to die in the Troubles, in a meticulously planned ambush near Jonesborough. The device, an estimated 1,000 pounds of explosive packed into a roadside culvert. The methodology was unchanged from 1973. The weight had almost doubled. By 1991, the RUC formally acknowledged what had been operationally true for 16 years. No mobile police patrols had operated in South Armagh without full British Army support since 1975. The British Army of 1979 was, by any objective measure, a professional conventional force with nearly a decade of Northern Ireland experience and the full weight of NATO standard equipment behind it. Its 321 Explosive Ordnance Disposal Company had been operating continuously in Northern Ireland since 1971, developing specific counter-IED procedures across hundreds of call-outs. Its electronic countermeasure systems were purpose-built for the threat environment and continuously updated. The surveillance architecture built after Warrenpoint, The observation towers, the agent networks, the covert operations eventually penetrated IRA structures across most of Northern Ireland and shifted the operational balance in the security forces' favour in many areas. In South Armagh, against the specific methodology of the Culvert bomb campaign, none of it was ever decisive. The ECM systems couldn't find a copper wire. Helicopter surveillance couldn't reliably locate a device planted months earlier in a drainage ditch beneath a settled field margin. The intelligence networks that compromised IRA operations elsewhere couldn't penetrate the close rural community of South Armagh at the same speed or depth. The hilltop observation posts, erected from 1986, changed the risk calculation in the high ground. But the Brigade, with accumulated engineering expertise, community support, and operational patience that no conventional military organisation could replicate, continued to function within that environment until 1997. The South Armagh Brigade's total losses across the entire campaign, from 1969 to the final ceasefire, were 10 members killed. Against 165 British security force deaths within 10 miles of the area's geographic centre, 1,255 recorded bombings, and a military force that spent 20 years flying supplies over roads it had been formally forbidden to drive on, the exchange ratio the brigade achieved is one that analysts of asymmetric conflict continue to study. The MOD's post-conflict assessment, drafted by officers who had served in Northern Ireland and released for public record in 2006, confirmed the strategic verdict in a sentence: overt road movement was forbidden in South Armagh for many years. The British Army possessed the most capable armoured vehicles in Western Europe. Saracens, Land Rovers, 4-ton lorries with ECM equipment mounted to the cab. None of it was adequate, because the threat had never been at road level. The danger had been placed beneath the road weeks or months before the convoy formed, by men who knew the location of every drainage pipe in the county, who had watched the Army's routines and response drills across years of observation, and who had calculated precisely which stone gateway the surviving soldiers would move to after the first blast. The soldiers in those vehicles could scan the hedgerows until their eyes ached. The device was already beneath their wheels. In some cases, it had been there before they left the base. In some cases, before they arrived in Northern Ireland. The road was gone. The convoy drove and scanned and hoped. The men with the copper wire waited. The drainage infrastructure of a working Irish farming county had become a weapon system that a NATO-equipped army couldn't neutralise, and the sky, in the end, was all that was left to them. Subscribe for more stories like this.